in all due seriousness, in your books, the just insane level of corruption that we will get into that was being covered up and was being swept under the rug.
The man who knew too much, Professor
David Nutt, the government's
chief advisor on drugs policy, has been
sacked by Home Secretary Alan Johnson. Now it's predicted many more of his colleagues will resign in protest at the move.
Zero correlation between the harms of drugs and the drug laws. Billy's mother said, well, my kid is having like 1,000 fits a month. She couldn't get medical cannabis here, so she went to the America. She got cannabis there, and it transformed him. He went from thousands of fits a month to 0 fits a month. I am certain that tens of, maybe hundreds of children with severe epilepsy have died because they can't get the medicine, or the parents can't afford the medicine. So I think it is outrageous. And
meet Professor David Nutt. Yes, that actually is his real name. Globally famous neuropsychopharmacologist who went on the BBC making the radical statement that alcohol is more dangerous than LSD, and instantly lost his job as the UK's top drug advisor. Since then, he's written best-selling books on alcohol, cannabis, and psychedelics, dispelling myths on their actual harms, and continues to expose governments for dangerous drug policies which have been proven to endanger people's lives for political gain. Dr. Nutt was the first person ever to scan a brain on LSD. He created the first science-backed drug harms chart and is now creating alcohol-free alcohol. Skipping this episode could be riskier than horse riding on MDMA, and remember to subscribe before your dopamine receptors rightfully accuse you of malpractice. Should cannabis be recreationally legal?
My view is it would make a lot of sense to make cannabis legal recreationally in the UK.
Maybe there is some data that does affect brain development. I mean, what do you think about that data?
It's some of the worst science I've ever seen published. I do not believe that cannabis, you can say absolutely categorically, cannabis use in adolescence affects the brain in a negative way, unless you're so stoned you don't turn up for your exams. There's an absolute desire not to believe the truth about medical cannabis. And do you know why? So this is perhaps the worst dishonesty of all.
David Nutt, you were the UK's top drug advisor, and then one day you were sacked. Paint that story. What happened?
Well, I made a fundamental mistake, which is I told the truth about drugs on the BBC.
What was that truth?
Well, the truth was, I was asked a question. In your analysis of drug harms, you claim that alcohol is more harmful than LSD. And I said, well, everyone knows that's true. You didn't need to do research to do that. And the world went mad. I mean, I went from an interview on the Morning Today program. I went from that to doing about 12 interviews across all the world that day. Got on the front page of USA Today the next day. Friends from America saying, David, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is the end of you. And of course it was, as in that career as drugs advisor.
Why was that so controversial? I have to assume that at that point, there was already substantial evidence that a lot of the illicit and banned drugs were not only not as harmful as they previously thought they were, but also that they had huge medical benefit. Is that the case?
Well, there was evidence, but it was being actively suppressed, denied, resisted. I mean, what was that interesting? And I think the reason we're having this conversation is that my sacking was a convulsion, and because it forced an honest dialogue. Up to that point, no scientist had gone on to certainly the British media and told the truth about drugs, because they kind of knew if they did, it would be a disaster for them. But being much less skillful at avoiding direct questions and actually at that point thinking this is just ridiculous, always skirting around the truth, I thought, no, just tell it as it is. And in hindsight, the ones that didn't get their jobs, they got knighthoods and things. But at least, I got a bit of public accolade anyway. and I'm now on your program. So, it was worth it.
It all came to this moment right now. This is why it was worth it for you. But in all due seriousness, though, you have to be quite satisfied with what I think is a cultural revolution that you started. Like maybe a public sacking is exactly what was needed, and somebody unfortunately needed to be put on the chopping block. But in your books, the just insane level of corruption that we will get into that was being covered up and was being swept under the rug, and it was all kind of unearthed because of this. So there must be, you must think of that as a positive.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't set out to become a martyr, but actually in hindsight, it worked quite well. And largely because there was such hysteria about it. People got interested. Up to that point, people have said, well, there's these crazy kind of odd hippies and odd, eccentrics that kind of think, drugs can be useful. But sure, we all know the drugs are dangerous and drugs are harmful. So, let's just go along with the status quo. And then suddenly people say, well, hang on, maybe the status quo isn't so. If the chief advisor's telling you the status quo is wrong, maybe he's right. So it began a discussion which has, persisted. And I think it's opened doors. It's helped open the medical cannabis door. It's opened legalization of cannabis in many countries, legalization of mushrooms in some states and in some countries. Yeah, it's begun a process of what you might call a kind of open, honest dialogue about drug harms and drugs and drug benefits, which we never had before.
Absolutely. When do you think was the first moment that you realized the UK government was making policy decisions on drugs based on politics and not scientific evidence?
Probably when I was asked to take on this job as the sort of senior scientific advisor. I wasn't the chair at that time. I was asked to take on the job as the chair of the scientific committee of the ACMD in about 2000. And I said, well, I'm kind of interested in that because I know quite a lot about drugs. And I actually, at that time, thought drug policy was probably, at least partly, scientific. But when I said I'd take on the job if I was allowed to develop a systematic way of scoring drug harms, which I've been working on before. There was a very important and influential report by Lady Ruth Runciman, which came out in 1999. And it came out about the same time as the House of Lords report on medical cannabis, which I gave evidence to. And I was the sort of chief doctor on the Runciman report. And in order to think objectively about drug harms, I developed a 9-point scale of harm, which showed, at the very least, that cannabis shouldn't be a Class A drug, as some forms of it were then. And when I was asked to join the government committee, I said, I will do that if we can use my 9-point scale of harm to look at drug harms. And the reason I said that was because they said, we'd like you to join, and would you like to come along to a committee meeting just to see how it goes, see if you feel you could join this committee? So I went to this meeting, which was in the deep inside that huge Stalinist building, which was the Home Office, just opposite New Scotland Yard. And I sat in this dark room, and these so-called experts started talking to me about ecstasy. And I said, well, as far as I can see, having been on the Home Office's ecstasy panel 7 or 8 years before, ecstasy really wasn't that harmful, provided you didn't dance all night and not drink anything. And one of the scientists, he was a professor, he said, we will never reschedule ecstasy over my dead body. And I thought, okay, so we're clearly having a slightly different kind of dialogue here. I'm talking about evidence, and you're talking about beliefs. And that's why I said, okay, I can't join this committee unless we do it. We have this transparent, systematic way of assessing drug harms. And they said, okay. And in fact, my approach was endorsed for the first 5 years. And that was because they had a home secretary, maybe the best home secretary we've had in my lifetime, a man called Blunkett. And I mean, possibly because he was blind and thought differently, to others, and had come across, challenges in his life. He was interested in improving the quality of decision making, and so they let us do
What a radical idea, right?
absolutely, yes. And we did this, and it took us 5 years to go through all the drugs, and eventually 2 years to get it published. 2007, we published the first paper on the comparative harms of drugs, which showed that, well, it showed there was zero correlation between the harms of drugs and the drug laws. And that's when I began to think, okay, so, well, we got people in prison for years for drugs which aren't very harmful. In some countries, they execute you based on international, conventions which say these drugs are very harmful and very dangerous. That cannot be right. So I began to sort of argue that we should think differently then. And the more I argued, the more the government entrenched, and eventually they decided better to get me out of the tent, which is a very dangerous thing. It was always better to be in the tent, isn't it?
It's astounding, really. What were some of the high-level findings of that report? Give a few of the headlines.
Well, bottom line was alcohol was way more dangerous or harmful than we had imagined. And that's because, of course, when you look at the overall harms of alcohol, and it turns out almost every family in Britain, and the same would be true in Ireland, has been damaged by alcohol, either because someone's become an alcoholic and rotted their liver or their brain or their heart, or someone's been beaten up or driven into by a drunk driver, etc. So alcohol harms permeate our society. And when I started off working for the Home Office, they said, well, alcohol's not a drug, so you can't consider it under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And I said, well, of course it's a drug. No, it's not a drug, no. So, in fact, it wasn't until I was sacked, very interesting, after I was sacked, the Home Office, when they carried on doing work, they accepted to my successor that actually they could consider alcohol as a drug. And in fact, by the way, some people don't often know this, but when they were trying to bring in 2016, when the British government brought in the Psychoactive Substances Act, which basically made anything that affected your brain a psychoactive substance, they conceded that alcohol was a drug because they had to exempt it. They had to say it is psychoactive, but we're going to pretend it isn't because it's been around for a long time. And we said, well, what are the grounds for exemption? And they said the ground for exemption was historic use. To which I said, what? Or precedent, they said. So I said, well, how long is precedent? Because you've said that alcohol precedent is many thousands of years. We agree that. But you also said that tobacco and caffeine are also precedented, and they're just a few hundred years. So where does the threshold come in? And cannabis, by the way, has been around for a few hundred years. Nitrous oxide for 200 years. What's the definition of precedent in law? To which they've never given me a satisfactory answer. So again, they make it up as they go along.
I think I remember from your brilliant book, Cannabis, Seeing Through the Smoke, that cannabis in some form might have been the first ever medicine to be written down in the pharmacopoeia 6,000 years ago. Not likely to be wrapped up into big blunts and passed around a circle, but in some form, cannabis has probably been consumed for thousands of years.
Oh, undoubtedly. It appears in Chinese and Ayurvedic pharmacopoeias 2,000 to 3,000 years before the common era, the modern era. So that's 5,000 years ago. There was a Siberian princess who was dug out the permafrost a few years ago, and she'd obviously died of breast cancer because you could see it was eating through her bones. And she'd been buried with the cannabis, the pain-killing cannabis with her. So it had been used certainly for many thousands of years. One thing I find most amusing is that the Chinese character for anesthesia is the same as the Chinese character for cannabis. So the Chinese knew what it was like to get stoned when they were inventing their alphabet.
That's a funny one. What do you think was the motivation of the government to want to pull the wool over their eyes quite that much? Because it just seems difficult almost to ignore that much evidence, to continuously over time make policy decisions when there's just this mountain of evidence beside you that it seems astounding that we can be that ignorant or corrupt, maybe is a better word. What were they thinking? What were their motivations?
Yeah, that's that's an extremely complicated question. It's obviously a really important question, but there isn't a simple answer. I mean, I suppose the simplest answer is we just do what America tells us. But that begs the question: is why does America do what it does? And I think there are multiple factors which play into this. My sacking was occasioned by the fact that an election was coming up, and the Labour government, didn't want to be seen as soft on drugs, because David Cameron, who eventually did get elected just after I was sacked in 2010, he had, well, I mean, he's an example actually of exactly the political problem. When he was a young man, we believe he took lots of drugs. He have admitted in his biography he was stoned every afternoon through the sixth form. He got into Oxford, and then in Oxford, his name was Cocaine Cameron, although he denies taking cocaine, but it's very likely he did take cocaine. And then of course he decides to stop it. He becomes a bit of a raver, but we're not entirely sure what he did there. But anyway, he comes into politics, and he's quite liberal when he's standing to be head of the Conservative Party. He's a liberal. He's going to change the world. And he says, well, ecstasy shouldn't be class A. We shouldn't be locking people up for ecstasy, probably because his wife was actually a Bristol University student. She was very keen on rave. So one presumes she might have done what many people at raves do. And then the day after, I mean, and of course, in my position, you monitor those statements very carefully. And the day after he became head of the Tory party, he said, oh, I got it wrong. These drugs are very dangerous. We can't change. And he said that, and there were like 5 old grandees of the Tory party behind him, sort of twisting his arm. And then he realized that there was political value in attacking the government on drugs. And he did it, interestingly. The banning of magic mushrooms, which were legal in Britain until 2004, that was driven by Cameron and the right-wing newspapers, particularly the Daily Mail, campaigning that the Labour Party was soft on mushrooms. So eventually mushrooms got banned because Labour decided they had to be at least as hard on drugs as the Tories. And there's even worse example, Evan. If you go to the States, the president that did the most damage to drug users wasn't Nixon, and he started it. So the president that produced the most harmful legislation for Americans was not Nixon. He started the war on drugs. But the person who put people in prison for life for their third offense, which could have been your first cannabis offense, was Clinton. And a few years ago, he said, oh, I'm really sorry, I made a mistake. I really thought it was going to stop people using drugs and taking drugs. But of course, he knew all along. He was just playing the game. Democrats are going to be tougher than the Republicans, because if you're not, the Republicans will just bang on that we're weak on drugs. So the first thing to say is that drug laws are almost all political. And they have really been since 1933, when the US Senate repealed the law of banning alcohol. And that was a seminal moment, because it didn't just allow alcohol back into circulation, but it changed the attitude to other drugs, because the drinks industry were really sure. They were made it very certain they weren't going to fall into the same trap as got them banned in the first place. They were going to deflect attention away from alcohol, which carries on killing people, to other drugs. And they deflected it initially to cannabis, calling it marijuana, and then creating a hysteria about that. And then they consistently, the drug criminalization, the war on drugs, serves a really important purpose to deflect attention from alcohol, which of course was why when I said alcohol was the most harmful drug, the British media did not like that. They really, especially when you think quite a lot of journalists do partake excessively of the amber liquid, don't they?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's genuinely hard to believe. A few chapters of your book, I had to stop and be like, it's really that corrupt. It's that spineless that they have gone into office purporting to be doing what is a good service to the general public, and then they make, and it might seem like these decisions aren't massively important until you start unearthing the cases of where these drugs would save lives. This is really where it gets, I think, quite horrible.
You're absolutely right, Evan. There is a sort of assumption, well, you know, banning a drug couldn't do any harm, could it? I mean, yeah, okay, so people can find other drugs, particularly if there's alcohol. You can always go and take alcohol. But in fact, banning drugs can do enormous amounts of harm if you bother to discover what harms are being done and follow through, but a lot of governments don't. But the point you're really making is that the banning of drugs like cannabis and psychedelics, it's the worst censorship of medical treatment in the history of the world. I mean, it's like banning penicillin.
Yeah.
But the bans were, again, politically driven. The banning of psychedelics was because psychedelics were associated with the anti-Vietnam War protest. And the American government couldn't ban war protests. I mean, it probably would now, but then it couldn't. But it banned a drug, LSD, that it thought was fueling the protest. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. Obviously, it wasn't fueling the protest. What it was doing was making people realize that actually war was pointless. And the big statement, make love, not war, drop LSD or drop acid, not bombs. That was a direct challenge to the US international diplomacy policy of bombing the shit out of anything they could bomb.
Yes.
And then the war on cannabis started back in 1933, as I said. But in fact, one thing that we did in the UK was we refused to comply with the UN conventions, which said that cannabis had no medical value. And we carried on prescribing medical cannabis until 1971. And in 1971, when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in, we also decided to stop cannabis being a medicine. Now, no one knows what that decision was based on. No one's alive that was there at the time. Our best guess, and I've spoken to people who were sort of closer to it than I was in terms of age, they think that there was a deal done. The Americans wanted something. They wanted us to ban medical cannabis because they thought that it would stop recreational use, and they had a just say no policy. And we got something from that. I don't know, maybe payment for a nuclear base somewhere. But a deal was done, and we banned medical cannabis, and it took us from 1971 to 2018 to unban it. Yeah. In the meantime, quite soon after, the Americans by 1990 had unbanned it as a medicine. So you got hundreds of millions of Americans of having access to medical cannabis, and we persist in a ban, which we were forced to do by the Americans. We persist in that ban because neither of our political parties, the two main ones, have the courage, the spine, as you put it, to actually do something about the ban.
Right.
And the saddest thing of all, here's a twist that a lot of people won't know. We did the coalition government, the 2010 coalition government between the Tories and the Lib Dems. They had a Lib Dem drugs minister who was rational and sensible and said, well, I'm going to look at how best to do drug policy. And for the first 2 years, he went around the world looking at how to do drug policy. And he came back and he wrote a report, and his boss, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, said, you can't publish that. And he said, of course I can, I'm the drugs minister. And she said, no, I'm the Home Secretary. You cannot publish your report because it contradicted her philosophy, which was basically, no, drugs are bad, drugs are evil, keep them illegal. And eventually he resigned. So you had a minister, and that was our last hope, I think. When the Lib Dems had one slight grip on some power, even then they weren't allowed to use it. And when he resigned, he made this retelling comment. He said, working in the Home Office is like working in the Tory party. The Home Office is like an extension of the Tory party. It just perpetuates Tory policies as a civil service, which
It's insane.
Yeah.
I think one of the most heart-wrenching story that you talk about in the book is about Billy Caldwell.
Yeah.
Maybe tell this story, because this one just shed a single tear reading about this. Like, it's horrifying.
Outrageous, isn't it? Absolutely outrageous. So because we banned medical cannabis in 1971, it was impossible to get legal cannabis in this country. And when it became clear in the 1990s that medical cannabis was quite useful for children with severe epilepsy, and I should say, by the way, in 1862, a pharmacy was set up in London by a Dr. O'Shaughnessy who came back from India with medical cannabis. And he said that medical cannabis had many, many uses, particularly for epilepsy.
Wow.
We knew then medical cannabis was useful for epilepsy, but it got forgotten about or ignored until the Charlotte's Web resurrection back in the 1980s. And then British parents suddenly realized that there were American kids with severe epilepsy being treated with medical cannabis. And Billy's mother said, well, my kid is having like 1,000 fits a month and he's just a vegetable. So she couldn't get medical cannabis here. So she went to the Americas. She got cannabis there. And it transformed him. He went from thousands of fits a month to 0 fits a month. But she's from Northern Ireland, and quite reasonably, she thought, well, I'd like my son now to grow up where his family are. So she brought him back to Britain. This was in 2018. She brought him into the country with his medical cannabis, legally prescribed in the States and Canada. And in Heathrow, they just said, you can't have it. And she said, well, if he doesn't have it, he will die. And they said, well, that's not our problem. That's a decision, the government's decision. So they took it, and he did. He went into what we call status epilepticus, having continuous seizures for hour upon hour upon hour. And they admitted him, and then maybe this was a clever decision, they admitted him to St. Thomas's Hospital. St. Thomas's Hospital is just exactly across the Thames to the Houses of Parliament. So he's in St. Thomas's Hospital dying, and you've got the government on the other side of the Thames thinking, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? If he dies, the world isn't going to like it. I mean, we're killing his kid because we've taken away a legal medicine where, and in the end, they changed the law. And it was the courage of his mother that forced the law to be changed. And he got his medicine, but he had to pay for it. It took him 3 years to get it on the NHS. And the outrageous situation today is still that the vast majority of kids, and there's hundreds of kids on medical cannabis in this country, have to pay for it. There's only 6 prescriptions on the NHS.
And how do the other people get their medical cannabis in the UK?
So what happened was after the Connolly case and the law was changed to allow specialist consultants to prescribe medical cannabis. And that meant that you can get a prescription, but the NHS has another gatekeeper. So in the NHS, consultants might want to prescribe medical cannabis. Many do, but they're not allowed to by local, what we call commissioning committees or pharmacy committees. So doctors don't have the authority to prescribe what they want anymore. The other people decide what they're allowed to prescribe. So in the NHS, cannabis prescriptions have been blocked by various pressure groups, pharmacy groups, by different consultant groups. There are still plenty of doctors who don't think cannabis is a medicine. They don't believe that these kids are living because they take a medical cannabis. They think it's all placebo. And the parents say, well, that's ridiculous because they were on 7 other medicines and they didn't work. And this one, how can this one be placebo? The kids are unconscious when you start giving it because they're having so many seizures. But there's an absolute desire not to believe the truth about medical cannabis. And do you know why? So this is perhaps the worst dishonesty of all. A few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I think, the Parliamentary Select Committee on Medicine asked the head of the NHS and the chief medical officer, why weren't they rolling out medical cannabis in the UK? And the head of the NHS was now Lord Stevens. He's left the NHS England now. He said, because we think medical cannabis would be a route into recreational use. Now, when you've got a child who's dying because
Yeah.
thousands, that's an absolute insult.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, even if it were or was a route into recreational use, that would not be a justification for denying it to children. I mean,
Yes.
that's
Clearly.
that's an appalling statement, and we know it
Yes.
isn't. If he had bothered to consult experts, they'd have said, "No, we have a saturated market. We have a higher proportion of people using cannabis in Britain where it's illegal than in countries where it's legal. So the market is saturated." So that was a lie. That was a lie in order. Probably that's what made him when he went from Sir to Lord. And the other guy was the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, who's still the chief medical officer. And Chris Whitty said, "Well, we have to be careful about medical cannabis. We need to do proper studies because we have to make sure it's not going to be another thalidomide." Now, many of your listeners probably won't know what thalidomide is or was. Thalidomide was a tranquilizer that was given to women who had vomiting in pregnancy, and it led to birth deformities. That was back in the 1960s. And these are the people that have very short arms and legs. It's called phocomelia. Now, of course, we really would not want any drug to cause birth deformities. But of all the drugs we have, the one which we know has been given to more pregnant women than any other is cannabis. If cannabis was going to cause problems, we'd have known it in ancient China. And so
Yeah, we have a decent sample size on this one.
enormous. And so this is and the worst thing of all, Evan, this is a technical point, is when you do clinical trials, you never give the drug to pregnant women because of the risks. So even if they'd done proper clinical trials, we wouldn't know the answer. So it's again another completely illogical response, and it's politically driven.
Yeah.
You've got to try to stop the pressure for recreational cannabis in Britain by blocking medical use. Outrageous censorship.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, really, for any drug to have the efficacy that cannabis seems to have in some cases of epilepsy. Like, when will you have 1,000 seizures a month go to zero? Like, that's astonishing. And I think in the Billy case, it was within 10 hours or something that he was already back having seizures after they were seized in Heathrow. Like, there's almost no medication in history that has that kind of efficacy. So it has to be so clear and glaring and screaming how you continue to ignore it. And like, I can understand not wanting to immediately legalize it and make it recreational and lose your political base. But the point that you're denying sick children medication is just like, oh, we're in House of Cards. Like, we're in a Netflix documentary right now. Like, we're not in real life. I can't believe we're in real life with this level of corruption.
I think, and I'm glad you touched on this point, I think the denial of medical cannabis to children, and probably adults as well, because it's not being properly tested in adults, but adults will need even more and parents can't afford it. I think this is the worst health scandal since the Bristol children's cardiac operation scandal back in the early 2000s. I am certain that tens of, maybe hundreds of children with severe epilepsy have died because they can't get the medicine, or the parents can't afford the medicine, or they don't even know about the medicine because there's no active attempts to find these kids and treat them. I think it is outrageous, and it's just proved impossible to get the government to take notice, because they go to the experts, the so-called experts, who are the pediatric neurologists, and they say, well, there's no trial data. And the politicians say, well, look at the 21 cases that my charity Drug Science published. And they say, yeah, but that's not randomized controlled trial data. And the parents say, hang on, guys, these kids before, have been on multiple drugs before, it hasn't helped. We put them on this drug and they're getting better. Now, what you want us to do, stop it and watch them get sick, like Caldwell? And they say, yes, until you've proved that they need it, we don't believe. And the parents say, we're not going to do that. We can't put our children, that he could have died. You don't need that kind of evidence. They're just using that as an excuse. And as it gets to another point, Evan, which is a broader point, and this may not be of relevance to your listeners, but I think the medical profession has become de-skilled. I think doctors have ceased to think for themselves. Doctors have become robots that do what pharmaceutical companies tell them to do or what NICE tells them to do. And if they're not told what to do, they don't do it. And even if, and even if they could think and do think and want to do things differently, I think, they then come across these hurdles I've mentioned where, you might want to prescribe medical cannabis, but your pharmacy committee says no. And you've got to have this battle. Now, I've been in medicine. Wow, I started my first prescription wrote my first prescription in 1972. So that's 52 years of writing prescriptions. And all my life I have battled with pharmacy committees not wanting to innovate because they're or because they've got its cost implications, etc. But gradually we have won. The one we haven't won, unfortunately, is medical cannabis, which is, that's so detrimental to so many people. Because it's not just epilepsy. We're going to be we're publishing a paper quite soon on medical cannabis for OCD. We published one recently on medical cannabis for PTSD, all done out of the population of people who are paying for their medicine, but giving us data so we can monitor how they do through our Drug Science T21 initiative.
There's a heartwarming video online of someone with very severe Parkinson's, man in his 70s, spasming uncontrollably. I'm sure you may have seen it. It was very viral, but within 2 hits of cannabis in a vape is completely fine, and to a level that you're honestly like, you have to blink twice. Like, did they just replace that person with his twin? It's like from completely incapable of controlling any limbs, body, tremors, really uncomfortable, no ability for speech articulation. Like 5 minutes, 2 tokes, and he's like up posture correct, having a conversation, smiling, laughing, getting hungry, which is kind of the comedic end to it. It's like it's so heartwarming. I can't imagine a human being would see that video. I'll put it on screen as I was talking about this. Would see that video and then deny that person that medication. It kind of blows my mind.
Evan, it's worse. It's not just denying them the medicine. In many cases, it's arresting them. Medication.
Right.
Or arresting the people that provide them the medicine. I mean, that guy probably can't get out to get his medicine, but other people do it, and they get arrested for being drug dealers because they provide. Now, it's the vindictiveness of the vindictiveness emerges from the drug laws, the breaking down of people's doors at 3 a.m. by pseudo-military police, so they to collect a plant from a woman who's in a wheelchair. If knocked on the door, she'd opened it because she can't. I mean, drug laws are a license for a lot of criminal activity basically in the police and the prohibitionist services.
What are the main? Let's go a little bit more into the neuroscience. As much as I love the deep state conspiracy stuff, that I need to pretend this is a neuroscience podcast. What are the harms of cannabis in the brain?
Well, does cannabis cause any harm? The answer is yes. All drugs can cause some harm, but in the brain, what we know is that there are people who are schizophrenic, who, if they get very stoned, take strong cannabis, they often get more paranoid, and often their voices, the hallucinations, get stronger. So that's the population who are at greatest risk from taking cannabis. It begs a fundamental question, which is why they use cannabis. And when you speak with them, they say, well, I use cannabis because it actually helps me deal with some of the other tensions and some of the physical tensions and some of the muscle spasticity, etc. that I have. But the other reason they use strong cannabis, which is really the only form of cannabis, the pure THC, 10% or more THC products, the reason they use those is because our cannabis policy has eliminated almost all other forms of cannabis. So if they were allowed to access cannabis to relax them in the old traditional sort of 4% THC, 6% CBD combination, they probably wouldn't be getting paranoid and wouldn't be getting more psychotic. But our cannabis policy, which is directed at reducing the risks of cannabis, in terms of psychosis has actually magnified the risks of cannabis in terms of psychosis, because it has driven the market in the direction of much stronger, much more toxic products. In the same way as the American attempt to block access to drugs like oxycodone has driven the market to even more toxic compounds, fentanyl. In fact, there's almost a general rule which started actually even before the prohibition of alcohol. It started in about 1914 when we decided to stop the Chinese smoking opium, because we could actually focus hatred on a small population and who were using a drug that is used historically for thousands of years. So we banned opium smoking because it's very easy, just you can smell it. So what happened? People started injecting because the hypodermic needle had been invented. So that was the first example where you actually are making things worse. Yeah. And then, of course, alcohol prohibition. People stopped drinking alcohol. They started drinking moonshine, I think, hooch, methanol. That created, a significant number of deaths. And then, as it goes on, we've got this cannabis I've talked about. You've got attempts to curb the use of other opiates like heroin, leading to fentanyls, as well as oxycodone leading to fentanyls. You've got the banning of weak cathinones leading to monkey dust. There's almost not a single example where a ban hasn't actually aggravated the problem of the drug by essentially encouraging the use of more potent and toxic compounds.
You gave, I think, another good example of, is it Safrole? Could you explain this case? I was unfamiliar with this before.
So, well, boy, this is a kind of wonderful. It's almost too fantastic to really be true, but I'll tell you the story. So, in the 1990s, the US banned MDMA. For no good reason other than kids were having fun, and we did the same as we always do. Americans say jump and we say how high, sir. So we banned MDMA as well. But people carried on using it.
Child, what a horror! Never could have predicted this.
Why would they do that when we're told them not to? Because so in the late 1990s, the United Nations, we're not stopping the use of MDMA. What else can we do? And they said, why don't we why don't we ban the precursor? The precursor is an oil called saffrole, or sassafras oil. It comes from sassafras is a plant that grows in Thailand, Cambodia, etc. So the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime banned the production of saffrole. Nothing much happened for about 4 years, and then they made a huge discovery. They found like 50 metric tons of saffrole in a truck about to be boarded in Bangkok and sent off to America to make MDMA, or Rotterdam or something. So they got this, they destroyed it. That's half the world's supply of saffrole destroyed at a stroke. Front page news, UN, we have broken the back of the MDMA market. Okay, well, that's true. But the market doesn't go away. And just think what happens. You're a Chinese chemist sitting somewhere in China, waiting for your saffrole to be delivered. It doesn't come. But you got an order for a kilo of MDMA in Rotterdam or somewhere else. What are you going to do? You're not going to say, sorry, sir, I can't make the MDMA. Can I make an antibiotic instead? No.
What else can we make in the batch?
You make something. What they did was they then went to another essential oil called aniseed oil, anethol, which is structurally very similar to saffrole, but not identical, obviously. So aniseed oil is in everything. It's vast, cosmetics particularly, but also in lots of other domestic products. So it's easy. You get your aniseed oil, put it through the same reagents as to make MDMA or saffrole, but you don't get MDMA. You get two things. You either get PMA, paramethoxyamphetamine, or PMMA, paramethoxymethamphetamine. Now, these are amphetamine-like substances, but they're much more toxic than MDMA. So the ban on saffrole led to multiple. We had hundreds of deaths in Britain from PMA and PMMA. In fact, we'll still be killing people today. But luckily, in a way, luckily. The black market worked out, well, if we can't get our saffron from sassafras oil, we're going to make another precursor, which they made to get round the saffron. So then you have another precursor, so you can make MDMA again. So the PMA deaths go down because MDMA is back on the market. But there's another twist to that, which is it turns out the new precursor is just much cheaper than sassafras oil. So now, instead of making 40, 50 milligram MDMA pills, they make 350 MDMA pills. So people are now dying of MDMA toxicity because MDMA has become much cheaper. It's a bit like the old gin craze, when people could turn beer into gin, people were drinking gin in excess and dying. So again, a terrible example of how banning things almost always causes more harm. And
Yeah.
it doesn't, it betrays a complete lack of thought. The idea that banning anything stops people doing it is ridiculous, because we kind of knew that from American alcohol prohibition. So no one thought that was a good thing. But why were we applying that to every other drug? Because it's political, and it's also perverse. I mean, it's almost deliberate blindness, isn't it?
It's so illogical that you almost have to assume that what they're trying to do is get that headline in the newspaper rather than make actual real impact, right? Because anyone with two brain cells can realize that they're not going to change the market demand. I think you can give an excuse to the legislators in 1914, right? We didn't know how addictive opiates were back then, even though we might have had some ideas. But to do that 80 years later with the mountain of neuropharmacological data, it really seems like they're just scoring for points. They're jockeying for jobs. They're trying to raise their status, their hierarchy, because they're not making real impact with those sort of moves.
No, I agree with you. So it's more than just politics. In the media are huge protagonists in this as well. I used to make a joke that there are only three things newspaper editors can do. One is expose infidelity in vicars and footballers. The second one is encourage you to bet, and the third is to ban a drug. If you haven't banned a drug, I banned a drug. I banned this drug. I mean, and the example. I mean, the most recent ridiculous example was the Sun trying to ban laughing gas. Why would you want to ban laughing gas? I mean, why? But they knew that was stupid, so they changed the name. Well, we can't ban laughing gas, but if we call it hippie crack, everyone will want to ban it, because no one wants hippies coming back. With flares and bandanas. And we had to fight them. We had to say, you cannot call laughing gas hippie crack. I mean, that is just a lie. But they did it, and they did it for years. And they said, these footballers inhaling hippie crack. Why are footballers inhaling? They're inhaling nitrous oxide because they know it won't screw up their performance the next day. Whereas if they were drunk at a party, which to get to the same effect, that effect would last, for 24 hours. So the rational use of drugs is opposed by generally the right-wing media, because it's a way of selling newspapers, a way of making them seem important. It's just a way of manipulate. I mean, it's just a way of being hateful to people. And that, I think, also comes back to the fact that there's a strong sadistic trend amongst certainly some Western society, certainly the UK. I think as a country, as a nation, we much prefer to punish people than understand people. And we really hate young people having fun. I mean, old people, well, we don't remember having fun, so why should young people have fun? Let's make them suffer. Let's lock them up. One of the things I discovered on the when I was working on the Runciman report, very hard to get these data, but which Class A drug gives you the longest prison sentence?
Longest prison sentence. Crack cocaine?
No, MDMA.
That's so silly.
Why? Because, again, judges, if you're on crack, you're an addict, so we're going to give you some time off because you're an addict. If you're on heroin, you're an addict. But if you're using MDMA, that's just for fun. So you go and we'll lock you up for 6 years because you shouldn't be having fun and letting other people. I mean, it's invidious, isn't it?
It's bonkers. I think we've well highlighted what bad drug policy looks like. There has to be some examples of good drug policy. If you could wave your magic wand, what does really good drug policy look like that is aligned with our current scientific data?
So I think the overriding example is Portugal decriminalization, personal use. Stop people needing to sell drugs to get drugs. If people are caught using a drug for personal use, then either treat them. Yeah, well, definitely treat them. If they don't want treatment, help them get off, help them get clean. But don't give them a criminal record. Don't put them into the underclass where they have to keep. And that, I mean, the Portuguese experiment was a remarkable experiment. Most people don't realize it was driven by economic pressure. The costs of penalizing people for drug use are enormous. It was in Portugal. So they said, let's change, let's try it differently. And it was an amazing experiment. In the 20 years, when they treated drug users as humans rather than as animals, they reduced deaths from heroin to about a third of what they were before. Over the same period, when we stopped treating drug addicts, we started pushing more punishment onto them, we doubled our number of heroin deaths. So that just shows the stark contrast. And the Portuguese experiment now has been endorsed. Every single division of the United Nations, except drugs and crime, has actually asked for that there be no criminal sanctions against drug users. Against drug dealers, yes, but people who use drugs, giving them a criminal record almost always makes their life worse. Yeah, decriminalization of personal possession, is a sensible approach. The other really good example, of course, is the Netherlands. With the cannabis coffee shops. Why did they do that? And they did it, by the way, in the face of enormous pressure from the UN, from the USA. They were hated for doing this, but they did it because they said, well, cannabis is not as dangerous as heroin. And we know that our drug dealers are dealing, in those days, they were dealing heroin and they were dealing cannabis, and some of them were also dealing a bit of cocaine. So they said, let's split the markets. Let the kids who want to get cannabis go to a coffee shop, and if people want to go to a drug dealer, well, they're not going to get cannabis because it's going to be cheap. So they separated the market. And that was remarkable because they had the number of kids in Holland taking heroin virtually disappeared because they weren't going to dealers and getting deals. Why? Here's your island. I'll give you a bit of free smack just to see if you like it. That didn't happen. So, and also remarkably, they didn't have more people using cannabis. And the reasons for that are interesting, but, because, there's less pressure, there's less addiction, also, there's less breaking the rules, isn't there? So some people use cannabis to show that they're kind of stepping outside of society. But that was a brilliant experiment. And of course, now we've got 200 million Americans having access to medical cannabis. I think about 150 million or more to recreational cannabis. The whole of Canada has got recreational cannabis. The world hasn't ended. Yeah, in some ways it's got a bit more rational.
Yeah. We always hear about cannabis as a gateway drug. Oh, it's a slippery slope. But we almost never hear the reverse argument, which is people trying to get off harder substances. Substances that they really don't want to, obliterate their whole central nervous system for a night. Maybe they just want a little bump, and that would help them get through. And I'm sure that happens inevitably around the world, but that's not really a narrative you ever hear about.
No, and it all really, if you ask, where does it all stem back to? It all stems back to the basically the prohibitionist abstinence temperance movement, going back to the 1860s, hugely Protestant, hateful of anything, even alcohol. That's why, the banning of alcohol was driven by the temperance movement, but they banned a lot of other drugs up to that point as well. The view that drugs are bad, and that's it. You don't need anything, just water. That's the problem, and that's a very strongly held belief system in a powerful country. Well, the most powerful country in the world, America, which is controlled, as you know, by a lot of old white men who've got Protestant ancestry, and sadly, they control most of the rest of the world for the WHO and the UN, and that hatred of anyone having relaxation, let alone fun, is bizarre, isn't it? But it's something to do with, I don't know, maybe if you're really good on this, maybe there is a heaven. But most of us really don't want to care, really, do we? We'd rather have Earth being a bit more pleasant rather than postpone everything till we get to possibly heaven.
In your opinion, should cannabis be recreationally legal?
my view is it would make a lot of sense to make cannabis illegal recreationally in the UK, particularly as you can't get it medically on the NHS. It might be a lot easier for people to get it if it was recreational. And actually, that's one of the reasons, by the way, why Canada, having made cannabis a medicine, they were disappointed in the fact that most doctors weren't prescribing, because doctors didn't know how to prescribe, or some doctors were just against it. And I said, well, if it needs to be obtained, why not let people make their own decisions and obtain it themselves? And so they changed the law, and now, self-medication is the way forward. And as I say, it certainly works. We work with my charity, Drug Science, works with a Canadian pediatric neurologist who's got he's got 1,000 kids on medical cannabis with fantastic results. And it's that's one of the reasons we're pretty confident that cannabis is both safe and effective, because there's growing data in countries like Canada.
And these are even children where, some of the research that's coming out is, and it's one of the things that I would regulate. If what I believe, I agree with you. I'm for recreational cannabis legalization. I would have some policies on age. I don't think it's unreasonable to say 21s, 18s. I'm curious on your opinion on that, because maybe there is some data that does affect memory. It does affect brain development. I mean, what do you think about that data?
Well, it's some of the worst science I've ever seen published. It's all, I don't know. I'm open. I do not believe that cannabis, you can say absolutely categorically, cannabis use in adolescence affects the brain in a negative way, unless you're so stoned you don't turn up for your exams. That's bad.
Right.
Evan, we're going to have to stop it now because I've got a next one. But
Absolutely.
should we pick up again next week?
I'd love to. This has been so much fun. We barely got into the neuroscience, Matt. I could talk to you for hours. It's so much fun. If we could schedule a round 2, it would be amazing, because I love this so much. But it's such a pleasure meeting you, and thank you so much for such an entertaining conversation. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. David Nutt. I thought it was so interesting. He's an amazing scientific communicator, and he stood up for what was important in a really important time when the UK government were being spineless and corrupt and literally killing children. So crazy revelations in that episode. If you're looking for a little bit more brain drug discussion, then I might recommend my conversation with Dr. Christoph Koch, one of the most legendary consciousness researchers in the world, and we share our own psychedelic experiences. Pretty interesting. And as always, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much.